The knock on the clubhouse door came at 12:40 in the morning. 3 sharp raps followed by a fourth that landed weaker than the first 3, like whoever was knocking had used up most of their nerve getting there at all. The clubhouse itself sat at the edge of town on a stretch of road with no streetlights for the last quarter mile. The kind of walk that would have been unsettling for an adult alone, let alone 2 kids who had covered it at a dead run. Sudie Cole was 16 years old, and she had her 11-year-old brother's hand gripped so tight in her own that neither of them could have said, afterward, which one of them had been holding on harder. Her whole body was trembling, though whether from the cold or the adrenaline of running 11 blocks in socks, she could not have said either. Behind them, parked in a loose row along the clubhouse fence, a dozen motorcycles sat silent under the yard's single floodlight, engines cold. The first sign either of them had that they'd found the right address in the dark. "Please," she said, the second the door opened, before she'd even seen who was standing on the other side of it. "Can you hide my brother for one night? Only tonight. Please, what happened at the Steel Talon clubhouse over the following 6 hours, and what it eventually cost Gerald Cole to have driven his own children to a stranger's door at midnight, was not something anyone standing in that doorway expected when the night began." Wes Bannister had been the one to answer the door, on his way out to check on a bike that had been giving him trouble in the back lot, and it took him a full 3 seconds to place the face staring up at him, hopeful and terrified in equal measure, before the resemblance clicked into something considerably more specific than a stranger. He froze in the doorway for that full 3 seconds, his mind refusing briefly to accept what his eyes were telling him. "Sadie?" he said. "Sadie Cole?" He was 50, a Hell's Angel for 26 years, and had been Diane Cole's older brother for considerably longer than that, Diane, who had died 2 years earlier of a stroke that took her in a single afternoon with no warning at all, leaving behind a husband who had, within 6 months of the funeral, decided that his wife's biker brother was not the kind of influence he wanted anywhere near his children. Wes had been close to his sister his whole life, closer to her, in some ways, than to anyone else in his family, and had been the one who taught her to ride a bicycle, then years later half-jokingly offered to teach her to ride a motorcycle too, an offer Diane always declined with a laugh that Wes could still hear clearly whenever he let himself think about her too long. She had been the one person in his family who never once treated the club as something to apologize for, showing up to his patch party the year he made full member with a homemade cake and a level of pride that had embarrassed him at the time and that he missed considerably more than he let most people know now. Wes had tried, for the first several months after the funeral, to stay involved anyway. A birthday card, a phone call, an offer to take the kids fishing the way Diane used to let him. Gerald had made each attempt harder than the last, citing schedules that never worked, declining invitations with excuses that grew thinner each time, until the pattern became impossible to read as anything but deliberate. Wes, worn down and unsure whether pushing further would make things worse for the kids rather than better, had backed off further than he was proud of admitting now, standing in his own doorway looking at a niece he had not seen in 18 months. She looked older than 16 ought to look at midnight on a Tuesday. Toby, beside her, had a fresh mark along his jaw that Wes's eyes went to and did not leave for several seconds. "He hit Toby," Sadie said, before Wes could ask. "Worse than before. I didn't know where else to go that wasn't going to send us right back to him." Before we get to what happened next, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe so this story doesn't get lost in the feed, and drop your city or state down in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means more than you'd guess to see how far a story like this can travel tonight. Now, back to that clubhouse doorway. Because whatever Wes Bannister decided to do in the next 10 minutes was about to matter more than anything he'd managed to do for these two kids in 18 months of standing on the outside of their lives. Diane Cole had died on a Thursday afternoon in March. An aneurysm nobody caught in time, leaving Sadie 14 and Toby 9, and a husband who had, by every account Wes heard secondhand over the following 2 years, come apart in ways nobody outside that house fully understood, until it was considerably worse than anyone had let themselves believe. Gerald had not always been a difficult man. He had, by Wes's own reluctant admission, been a decent enough husband to Diane for most of their marriage, steady if unremarkable. The kind of father who showed up to school plays and coached Little League on weekends. Grief had changed him in a direction nobody around him had predicted, souring first into a controlling grip on the household's routines, then into drinking that started as evenings and crept steadily earlier into the day, then into the specific, escalating cruelty of a man who had run out of better ways to carry a loss he never processed and had settled, instead, for making everyone around him carry a version of it too. Neighbors had noticed the porch light staying off more nights than not, had noticed Sadie walking Toby to school alone more mornings than seemed usual for a father who used to walk them both himself, and had, in the specific way small towns sometimes do, noticed without letting themselves act on what they were noticing. Sadie had absorbed most of it for 2 years, the way an oldest child in that kind of house often does, positioning herself between her father's temper and her younger brother whenever she could manage it, taking blame for things that were not her fault, because taking blame herself felt safer than watching Toby take it instead. She had gotten good at reading the specific quality of her father's silence that meant a bad night was building, good at finding reasons to keep Toby in his room, good at absorbing the smaller cruelty so the larger ones landed on her rather than on an 11-year-old still young enough that Sadie could not stomach the alternative. She had stopped inviting friends over sometime in the first year, had stopped joining the after-school clubs she used to enjoy, narrowing her whole life down to whatever version of it kept the house calm enough for Toby to still feel like a kid. Tonight had outrun every strategy she had. Gerald had come home from the bar angrier than usual, over something Sadie never fully understood. An argument, a bill, a memory of Diane that had curdled the way his memories of Diane so often did lately, and when Toby, tired and unthinking, had left a video game controller out where Gerald tripped over it. The reaction had been faster and harder than anything Sadie had seen from him before. She had gotten between them within seconds, but not before Toby took a strike across the jaw that left the mark Wes was still looking at. She had grabbed Toby's hand, grabbed nothing else, not even shoes, and run. She had thought, running the 11 blocks to the Steel Talon clubhouse in her socks, about calling the police first. She had decided against it in the same instant she thought of it, afraid of what happened to a family once police got involved, afraid of foster care splitting her from Toby, afraid of 100 outcomes that felt, in the panic of that specific night, considerably more frightening than the uncle her father had spent 2 years keeping her away from. She had run past 2 houses with porch lights still on, briefly considering knocking on a stranger's door instead, before deciding that whatever waited at the clubhouse felt more certain than whatever a stranger might do with 2 kids showing up barefoot at midnight. She had remembered the clubhouse from being 9 years old, tagging along with her mother to drop something off for Wes, remembering mostly the way everyone there had been kind to her in a manner that did not match anything she'd been taught to expect from men who looked like that. She remembered, specifically, a woman there who had given her a soda and let her pet a dog the size of a small pony, and a general feeling of safety that had stuck with her far longer than any of the details. It was the only address in town she could picture clearly enough at midnight to run toward instead of away from. Wes brought them both inside without a second thought, sat Toby down at the clubhouse's kitchen table and got a bag of ice wrapped in a dish towel against his jaw before he asked a single question beyond whether either of them needed a doctor right now. The clubhouse kitchen, usually loud with whoever was still up playing cards at that hour, went quiet the moment the two kids walked in. Half a dozen men setting down their hands without being asked to, understanding immediately that whatever this was took precedence over anything happening at that table. "Does this happen a lot?" Wes asked, his voice carefully even, though Sadie could see the effort the evenness was costing him. "More since Mom died," Sadie said, her voice barely holding together. "I kept thinking I could manage it." "Keep it off, Toby. Mostly, tonight I couldn't." Toby, still holding the ice against his jaw, spoke for the first time since walking through the door. "Sadie always takes it instead," he whispered. "She doesn't think I notice, but I do." Something in Wes's chest went entirely cold at that sentence, followed almost immediately by a fury he made himself set aside, the same way he'd learned to set aside anger in 26 years of riding with men who needed a level head more than a hot one in the moments that mattered most. Whatever composure Sadie had been holding on to for the entire 11-block run broke completely at her brother's words, and she pressed both hands over her face, crying in a way she had clearly not let herself do in front of Toby in a long time. He called the county's after-hours Child Protective Services line within the hour, not to bypass Sadie's fears about the system, but to make sure the system, this time, had an adult in the room who was not going to disappear once the immediate crisis passed. He called a lawyer he knew personally, a man who had represented the club on business matters for over a decade and happened to also handle family law on the side, and had him meet everyone at the clubhouse before the sun came up rather than waiting for a more convenient hour. He also called two club members he trusted most with exactly this kind of situation, a married couple who had fostered kids themselves years back, and asked them to come sit with Sadie and Toby so neither child spent the rest of that night surrounded only by strangers still working out what came next. The caseworker, who arrived shortly before 4 in the morning, a woman named Patrice, who had handled considerably more of these calls than she wished she still had to, took one look at Toby's jaw and Sadie's bare, scraped feet and did not need much convincing that emergency intervention was warranted immediately rather than after a more thorough investigation. Gerald Cole arrived at the clubhouse himself a little after 2 in the morning, having discovered his children gone and, apparently, having guessed correctly where they'd run. He pounded on the same door Sadie had knocked on 2 hours earlier, considerably less gently, smelling of the bar he'd never left that night, demanding his children back in a voice that carried none of the quiet menace of a man in control, and all of the sloppy aggression of one who had lost it entirely. Wes stepped outside to meet him, rather than let him anywhere near the kids in the state he was in. "They're staying here tonight," Wes said. "You're not in any condition to be arguing about it, and even if you were, that mark on Toby's jaw isn't something we're pretending didn't happen." "They're my kids," Gerald said. "Not yours. Never was yours to decide anything about them." "Wasn't my choice you cut me out for 2 years," Wes said. "Was yours. And now your son's got a bruise, and your daughter ran 11 blocks in her socks rather than wake you up to ask for help. That's not a story about me overstepping. That's a story about what's been happening in that house, without anyone else around to see it." Gerald took a step forward, and 2 other club members who had come outside without being asked moved into the space beside Wes, without a word passing between any of them. Not aggressive, only present. The specific kind of quiet crowd that changes a drunk man's calculations without anyone needing to raise a hand. The whole yard had gone silent, except for Gerald's own ragged breathing. The specific silence of a situation where everyone present understood exactly how it was going to end, and only Gerald himself was still catching up to that fact. "I want my kids," Gerald said, quieter now, something almost pleading creeping into his voice as the adrenaline of his arrival started to fade against the wall of calm he'd walked into. "You had your kids for 2 years since Diane died," Wes whispered, low enough that only Gerald could hear it. "Look at what that got them. Look at your son's jaw." The deputy, who arrived 20 minutes later, called by Wes the moment Gerald's pounding started, found a man too intoxicated to safely drive home. A documented injury on an 11-year-old that the responding officer photographed on the spot. And a 15-year, unbroken pattern that a CP's caseworker would spend the following weeks confirming through school records. A pediatrician's notes nobody had connected before. And Sadie's own careful, detailed account of 2 years she had spent trying to carry alone. The pediatrician's office, once contacted, produced records of 2 prior visits for injuries Gerald had explained away as ordinary childhood clumsiness. Explanations nobody at the time had felt equipped to question. Gerald was arrested that night on a charge of domestic assault against a minor. The first of several legal proceedings that would, over the following months, result in a permanent loss of custody and a mandated treatment program he would either complete or lose considerably more than custody over. He pleaded guilty, eventually, sparing the kids a trial neither the prosecutor nor Wes particularly wanted them to sit through, and was sentenced to a combination of jail time, probation, and a court-ordered program addressing both his drinking and the underlying grief neither he nor anyone around him had adequately addressed in 2 years. Sadie and Toby did not go into the foster system Sadie had feared all night. Wes, with the lawyer's help and a caseworker willing to move quickly given the circumstances, was granted emergency temporary guardianship within the week. Made permanent 4 months later, once the court proceedings concluded. The kids moved into the small house behind his shop, the same house Diane used to visit when the 2 of them were young enough that a fight between them still ended in laughter within the hour. Wes converted his old workshop office into a bedroom for Toby within the first month, and Sadie chose the room that had once been Diane's childhood bedroom on visits, a detail neither of them mentioned out loud, but that Wes suspected mattered to her more than she let on. Toby still has that dish towel. Oddly enough, kept it without anyone understanding why, until he explained, months later, that it was the first thing anyone had used to take care of him, without also asking something of him in return. He keeps it folded in his nightstand drawer, and Wes has never once suggested he get rid of it. Sadie has stopped, slowly, positioning herself as a shield for every bad moment in a room. She still watches Toby's moods more closely than most 16-year-olds watch anyone's, an old habit that Wes suspects will take considerably longer to unlearn than the immediate crisis took to resolve. But she laughs now in a way Wes says reminds him powerfully of Diane at the same age, easily and without checking first whether it was safe to. She rejoined her school's track team that spring, the first extracurricular she had allowed herself in 2 years, and Wes has not missed a single meet since. If this story reached you, if you believe a child's courage in running toward help, rather than away from it, deserves to be met with exactly the kind of adults who show up and stay, share it with someone who needs the reminder that asking for help is its own kind of bravery. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and whether you've ever had to be brave enough to ask a stranger or an estranged family member for help you weren't sure you'd get, and if you believe Sadie and Toby deserve the uncle who finally got to be there for them. Type safe below so they know it reached you too.